Generative versus usage-based school, and we have already discussed what they are independently. Now let's try to understand them in terms of their differences, in terms of the similarities, if there is any. For usage-based theories, the complexity of language emerges not as a result of language-specific instinct, but through the interaction of cognition and use. Now, in this particular theory, we see that the complexities emerges not from the language-specific instinct, rather the combination of cognition or the interaction the cognition has with the use. That cognition in terms of processing the language or linguistic data which is required to be used appropriately in any context or situation to fulfill the social function. So basically, cognition and its use, that has to be in line, that has to sort of supplement each other. So complexities are there when you have the interaction of cognition with the use, or having the understanding of what particular linguistic information or data is appropriate for a meaningful expression. These broad assumptions are in contrast with those of the generativists and structural tradition, who analyze language as a static or synchronic system, self-contained and autonomous from the cognitive and social metrics of language use. So basically, generativist or the structural tradition is different from this. There is no such thing as that. Their language is considered, or the language rules are considered to be present, having the innate ability. So you do not have the social aspect that has been taken care of in the usage-based school. In generativism, it's just that the linguistic rules are there, and they are independent of any pressure of social interaction or the embodiment of language use, social embodiment of language use, or the social factors. They do not sort of contribute in causing any confusion as far as the generativist approach is concerned. But in usage-based school, since the language is seen and understood when it is put into practice or in use, therefore you have this complexities in terms of the interaction the cognition has with the use. Much theoretical work in generativist linguistics followed from assumption that it was impossible for a child to acquire the rules of their grammar with the tools of behaviorism. We all know, and we have discussed behaviorism in detail, and we know that the behaviorist approach is that the learning takes place through stimulus-response process. But generativist linguistics follow that there is no such thing that you develop your language or you develop the acquisition having or using the tools of behaviorism, the tools which are the external factors or social factors in terms of any situation, in terms of your friends or environment. So they are not considered or not a focus of study in the generativist school of thought. The usage-based position is closely allied with that of cognitive linguistics. Now, cognitive linguistics does take into account the cognition in relation to society, and construction grammar, which focuses on the construction of the language, where the fundamental linguistic unit is the construction. Now, let's see some of the differences that are there between innate universal grammar and usage-based accounts of first language and second language acquisition. They are summarized by James H.Y. Tai in 2014. So if we can understand these differences, maybe we can have a better understanding of how the universal grammar or the generativist school of thought is different from usage-based school of thought. Number one, it says that at the level of brain, universal grammar approach, and universal grammar when we're talking about, we are referring to the generativist approach. It assumes that linguistic representation is localized in a language-specific module, and that is localized in LAD, language acquisition device, with its own rules and processing. In contrast, usage-based approach assumes plasticity to a great extent. Linguistic representation in brain can change in the course of first language learning as well as the second language acquisition and development. So, usage-based approach sees the plasticity or the ability to change when it comes to the first language acquisition as well as second language acquisition and development. Over here in the universal approach, you have the static or the linguistic representation is innate, is localized, which is opposing to the plasticity. Second says that children are creative and productive to start with innate grammar. That the child has the ability to produce the infinite data from the finite rules. That is what the innate grammar says. However, in usage-based approach, children are conservative and unproductive to start with. Only gradually they become productive by induction through experience. So, generative approach says that they are creative and productive based on the existence of innateness of the linguistic rules. But usage-based approach says that they learn or they become productive and creative as they get exposed to the input through experiences. They develop it gradually. In universal grammar approach, the role of input is underdetermined because of poverty of stimulus. So, underdetermined, that it is not sufficient due to the fact that they do not take into account the stimulus response process, and therefore they also lack the negative evidence, which is that they believe there is no such thing as the understanding of ungrammatical sentences, or they say there is no evidence of the ungrammatical sentences. However, in usage-based approach, all linguistic structures emerge from generalization of the input through induction. So, linguistic structures emerge from the use of that language, and that happens in generalization and input through induction. In UG approach, innate core grammar needs mechanisms such as maturation, triggering, linking rules. In contrast, the UG-based approach requires children to figure out linguistic system by adapting social communicative behavior. So here the maturation works, the triggering, the processing, cognitive processing, and how it is triggered, how you link one rule to the other, how the understanding of one rule precedes the other and the second rule precedes the third rule activate. But here you see in the usage-based approach is the finding out the system through communicative behavior, social communicative behavior. According to Bevan, the naturalistic and experimental evidence based on, this is a natural process when people are interacting with people around themselves, there's a social phenomena, and experimental evidence you have in terms of the interaction. It does support the usage-based theory, but at the same time it is claimed that language acquisition is done with general cognitive process. So this is basically the cognitive approach which is relevant to generativism. And universal of linguistic structure derive from the fact that people everywhere have the same set of general cognitive processes. So you have the cognitive aspect here in words of Bevan. To conclude, the usage-based theory focuses on meaning as use, and that structure emerges from use, whereas generativism or generative school of thought refers to language as a static or synchronic system independent of language use.